When you think about dollar, euro, Bitcoin, Ethereum, you think about wins and losses in sport, in life, in relationship, in anything. Something in your brain and body has to keep track of that. Did you win? Did you lose? What's a letdown? What's a celebration? And I think one of the most important findings in the last few years in neuroscience is that while the molecule dopamine is associated with reward, it's more about motivation and craving. We don't often think about motivation and fear as in the same breath or the same sentence. We are accustomed to thinking about the fact that when we're afraid of something, we can freeze up. But really, motivation and fear are in the same pathway. And believe it or not, they're in the same chemical pathway. So the only way to talk about motivation is to talk about the molecule dopamine. Dopamine is known for its feel-good properties. We think, a dopamine hit, or, it feels so good, a rush of dopamine. But dopamine's main role in the brain and body is craving, motivation, and pursuit, okay? And in the absence of dopamine, we don't feel motivated. And this is really the new evolution of the understanding of dopamine in neuroscience, which is that dopamine itself is not the reward. It's the build-up to the reward. And the reward has more of a kind of opioid bliss-like property, which itself is not bad if it's endogenous, released from within. But when we can just sit there like the rat with no dopamine, gorging ourselves with pleasures, so to speak, what you end up with is somebody that feels really unmotivated, and those pleasures no longer work to tickle those feel-good circuits. And so there's no reason for them to go out and pursue anything. And that's a pretty dark picture. So the keys are to pursue rewards, but understand that the pursuit is actually the reward if you want to have repeated wins, okay? The celebration has to be less than the pursuit. And that's hard for some people to do. If you can start to identify the craving as its own internally released drug, this thing dopamine, that is a source of motivation, then what you realize is that capturing the reward is wonderful, but attaching dopamine to the reward is actually a little bit dangerous. And when we talk about stress, I think it's also important that we divide that into two kinds of stress, because it defines the two approaches that people can take to combat stress, fear, anxiety.
What are the two types of stress?
Okay, the two types of stress are, the one is the one we're almost all familiar with, because when we hear stress, we think pupils dilating, hands shaking, heart beating, oh my goodness, or really upset, you're stuck in traffic, something is really bothering you, you're angry, you're having the fight or flight response that, that phrase gets thrown around a lot. And in those circumstances, it's very important that people take control of their mind and their body in a way that allows themselves to calm down, to reduce the so-called stress response. And we can talk about tools to do that are very concrete and that are very reliable. There's another side of stress, which is when there are a lot of things happening in the world, pandemics, you can't work because there's another shutdown, or there's strife in your life, or things are really challenging and you're feeling exhausted and you can't get mobilized and alert enough. And this has never really been cleanly laid out for people. And what I call the whole process is one of limbic friction. Okay, so the limbic system are these areas deep in the brain. Limbic literally means edge, they're near the edge of the brain. And when we're stressed, there's a lot of activity in these brain regions. And then we got our forebrain, our prefrontal cortex for the aficionados. And when we're in a thinking and calm and deliberate and rational manner, when we can control our body and our mind, it's called top-down processing. We're controlling ourselves. But there's a lot of friction with that limbic pathway. Now, there is something called adrenal insufficiency syndrome, which is a real medical condition where people can't actually produce enough adrenaline. But most of us have enough adrenaline in our bodies to last 200 years, 2 lifetimes. So the adrenals don't really burn out. What happens is people are so overactivated, they're in this alertness, hyper alert stress for so long that eventually they kind of crash into the over fatigue stress. If people can do what you do, they're going to be in a much better position in life. Doesn't matter if it's school, sport, relationship, any domain of life. If you can start to register, that craving and that friction and that desire, that almost kind of low level of agitation, sometimes high level of agitation, that is that I'm trying to impose my will on the world in a benevolent way, we hope, that's dopamine. It's working with its close cousin, which is epinephrine, which is adrenaline. They are very close cousins. In fact, dopamine manufactures epinephrine. A lot of people don't know this, but adrenaline is actually made from the molecule dopamine. Okay, so those two are hanging out together. It's like crave work, crave work, crave and work, crave and work, crave and work. And then you get the win. And some people allow the big peak in dopamine to be associated with the win. And smart people learn to adjust their celebration internally, right? This is all internal. The moment you start achieving some success, that things are going to get easier, it gets worse. There are more opportunities, and therefore your structure gets disrupted. More email, more texts come in, more amazing possible relationships and places to eat and things to do. It actually starts to undermine the whole process if you're not careful. And that's coming from somebody who, I'm fortunate to not have substance abuse tendencies and things of that sort. But I still I have a list, and now I make it every day, because when I just put it next to me and I didn't write it out, it didn't work. But it literally starts: dog walk number 1, get sun. I mean, like really basic stuff. I mean, I basically have to handhold myself in the same way that I talk about protocols on podcasts and that we're talking about here. I talk to myself that way as well. Get sunlight. Then I do a 90-minute work block, which means I use the program Freedom on the computer. No internet, no phone. I turn off the phone, I put it in my car. Learning to cultivate a life of focus. And I should say, it should be the way to support that is to have components of your day of wordlessness and defocus. I do want to emphasize that, because it's not about waking up and from morning till night being ultra focused, right? I don't do the make my bed first thing. I admit it. I sometimes like it happens midday. Okay, all right. I wouldn't make it in the military, but we knew that already anyway. So it's about being in recognition of where you're at and focused and dropping in deeply for certain portions of the day. But I also have a deliberate decompress time of my day, right? I take 30 minutes a day, and I either take a nap, or I do a yoga nidra, or I just let my mind go. But that does mean not mindless scrolling, although I do some mindless scrolling too. I allow myself that. But having periods of the day where you let the mind defocus and just kind of drift in the same way that your mind drifts a bit during sleep, that is what allows you to focus. So it very intensely afterward, or on a consistent basis.